In the name of Meher Baba, we'll begin. My name is Nick Principe. I found out about Baba in the late 60s. Baba was still in the body, but I did not have a chance to meet him physically. However, over the years, I've had the great good fortune to spend quite a bit of time with his close family members and the Mandali. And in some cases, I realized I was blessed because it was fairly intimate. In those days, I was a hairdresser when I first found out about Baba, so I got to cut the Mandali's hair, and I'd be with the ladies after Mirazad would close and the bus would leave, and I'd get to stay there, and Mani would set up a salon for me, and I would cut the ladies' hair. Bao stayed with me 8 or 9 times in the States when he would come in those days, and he actually said to me one time, "You will become famous." He said, "Even if you cut off half a mustache, you will become famous for that." Which, of course, thank God didn't happen. But anyway, it was a blessing. I got to cut Adi's hair. I got to shave Muhammad, the must. So, and there was a good lesson for me with that, because there was a time when I resented the profession, because I felt that all I was doing was serving vanity. The people who would come in, because I had a little salon living in Myrtle Beach, I want this a 1/4 of an inch here, 1/4 of an inch there, and I would think, oh my God, this is just, and I had that whole idea I didn't want to have anything to do with it, until one day when Adi was in the States in the 70s, and I got a call from Jack Small, who would travel with him, and Jack said, "Adi needs a haircut. Can you cut his hair?" I said, "Are you kidding?" Of course. So in that sense, I had a tremendous intimacy with Mandali. This group of stories is actually, hopefully, will be published in a pamphlet, booklet form, and I have the title of it is "Random Acts of Kindness." And that the reason I came up with that is that I realize my entire life, including this very moment, Baba has been nothing but kind to me. And the Mandali also were extraordinarily kind in everything they did. Even when they scolded us in those days, and they did that if it was necessary, but they were gentle and kind. And even when it hurt, it wasn't long before I realized they were doing things or saying what they said for my betterment, not for their own satisfaction. These stories, the way they came about, I was one of the very first times I was in India, and I saw that some people had cassette recorders. And I thought, oh, what a good idea, because they were allowed to get close to Erich to record. If you didn't have a recorder, it's like people now, if you have a camera, people step aside and let you get close enough to take a picture. So my first trip was in the early 70s. Second time I went back, I had a recorder with me, and sure enough, people parted, and I sat right in front of Erich and set my little recorder up. And he looked at it, and he looked at me, and he said, "What's that?" I said, "It's a tape recorder, Erich," as if he didn't know what it was. But I answered him literally, realizing that he wasn't asking me literally. Anyway, I said, it's a tape recorder. He said, why? I said, well, I want to be able to remember what you're talking about. I want to get these stories. He said, if you have that tape recorder, you're going to pay attention to the tape recorder and not pay attention to the stories. He said, pay attention to the stories. And subsequently, I had other Mandali kind of say the same thing to me. For instance, there were some Mandali who didn't have much experience with other Mandali because of age differences or because of where Baba kept them apart from each other. And for instance, when I returned to the States after my first trip to India, to Myrtle Beach, this is in the mid-'70s, and Kitty, I met with Kitty, she wanted to know about the trip and who I met, and I mentioned the meeting Bao, and Kitty said to me, who's that? I said, you don't know who Bao is? And she said, no. And I realized later, it took me a long time to realize, is that Bao came to Baba after Kitty did. And Kitty was sent to America to live at the center, and she didn't go back, and Bao was never on those trips with Baba when he came. So she didn't know, she hadn't met him, she didn't know anything about him. So she wanted to know about Bao, who he was, and what was my impression of him, that sort of thing. So that also kind of, I realized that, and again, because of age, some of them had come and gone before some of the others did. As a matter of fact, kind of a funny thing with that, first trip to India, I was with Erich's small group of people. He took us to Happy Valley. We went to some of the caves connected with Baba, taking the Mandali there. And one of them was a Shiva Lingam. Now, for those who don't know, a Shiva Lingam is, I guess Shiva is regarded as the god of creation. And Shiva Lingam is a small cave, and there's this enormous phallus in the middle of the room. Erich is on one side with, now there were very few people in those days. There was some people there. I'm on the opposite side of this giant thing with my wife standing next to me. And Erich is explaining that people would come in and as an act of worship of creation, they would break a coconut on the top of this phallus and then collect as the milk would come down to the bottom. And I'm kind of thinking, this is a very strange kind of thing. I was raised a Catholic. I had no idea about any of this. And then, as clear as a bell, Erich is, I'm certain, looking straight at me. And the one person I remember being in there was Marshall Hay. And when I talked to Marshall Hay about this afterwards, and I told him what Erich said, he said, no, Erich said that to me. I don't know where he was in that group, and I felt like Erich was looking at me and said that to me. And what that was, he said, unless and until one gets over sex, you will not be able to enter the path of love. I was a young man, married. I thought, this is the wrong place for me. I'm out of here. And I made up my mind that I was going to leave India and come back to the States. And enough of this Meher Baba stuff, I wasn't going to give up sex. And I was, in those days, you could only stay at Mehrabad. You could go Monday, and you had to leave Friday. And there was no residence there really, except Padri was there, Muhammad was there. The food was cooked by the local village women who would come over, and God, that was terrible, but we ate it. It was just vegetables cooked in grease and chapatis and rice, and that was, for an Italian, that was terrible, but I endured. And I have this image when the first time I was there, I was so hungry because meals were just inadequate for me, and I had filled my plate up first dinner, And all of a sudden, I knew, I didn't see him as much as I sensed him. Padre came through. And I heard his booming voice. He said, "You better eat all of that, mister." And I said, "Oh," he said, I forced it down. And boy, I tell you, there was a queue at the toilet later on that night. Everybody was standing in line because they were cooking in some kind of oil that we were not used to. It was like, anyway. So on the weekends, we'd go to Pune, and I would spend time with Jal, with Baba's brother Jal. And I'll get back to Jal because he was really my initial Baba connection. Anyway, we're in the hotel room, and Jal wanted to know everything, how things were going. And I told him, I said, "Jal, I think this is a mistake being here, and we're going to go to Air India and go back to the States." He looked at me, he said, "Why?" And I told him, I said, "Well, we heard that we have to give up sex." And he looked at me and he said, "Who told you such nonsense?" And I said, "Erich." And Jal said to me, and I quote, "Erich is new to Baba. He doesn't know what he's talking about." And I thought to myself, wow. He said, "You're married." He said, "Anything you do with your wife is fine." And I realized that only somebody like Baba's brother could say that Erich was wrong about something. And I realized afterwards it wasn't that he was wrong, is that Erich held up the highest ideal that could be held up by a human who's on the road to divinity. And the others had different functions. Jal was much more connected. Baba had told Jal to be his emissary for Westerners. So Jal was much more Western, even though he was single, never married. I asked him one time, I was always very informal and impertinent, I might say. And I was never shy about asking them anything. Any of the Mandali, I would talk to them about anything. And I asked Jal one time, I said, "Did he ever want to have sex?" And he looked at me and said, "Oh, no." He said, "It would be like having," he said, but what is the body?" He said, "The body is full of pus and blood and shit." He said, "Why would I want to have sex with that?" And he said, "Besides, it would be like having sex with my brother, with Baba." And there's more we'll go into with that. But what I realized with that very early on is that there is no clear, this is what you should do and this is what you should not do. Even those of us who were with the Mandali, you'd get one message from one and a different message from the other. And what it's done for me is pointed out that you gather as much information as you can, but ultimately you can't then blame it on anybody else. You make your best decision, your best choice, your best action, and then you either enjoy or suffer the consequences of it. A little subsequent story with that, Alaba came to the States one time. When he came to the States, Mani had agreed and he was allowed to come to Myrtle Beach to be with me in Chapel Hill. Drove down to pick him up, took him back to Myrtle Beach for a few days, back and forth. He told me that the Mandali did not want him to come to the States. Erich and Mani said, "No, don't come to the States." He insisted that he should come to the States. And that was it. He just came. Another little story with that, very similar. Bao told me that he had some work to do for the trust. And while he was there, he needed to have some government official sign a document. And they But the government official, when he was approached, he kind of hinted to Bao that he needed some money, some graft. Bao agreed and went to talk to Mani and Erich. Both of them told him not to do it. But he really needed these documents signed, and this was the only guy who could do it, and he decided he would do it. And he sent a servant over to this fellow's house, gave him whatever the bhiksha was that he wanted. And the official said, okay, come in the morning, I'll have all the documents ready for you. That night, the fellow had a heart attack and died. Bao did not get the documents signed and lost all the money. So here again, you have the Mandali saying, don't do it, and you have and one of the Baba's biographer, long-time night watchman, Mandali saying, I'm going to do it anyway. So the best I can say is, which actually, when you hear these stories, there are others. Some of this I was told personally, intimately. Some of them were told in group settings. I've actually had some that have gone around the world and come back to me, and somebody said, oh yeah, this is what happened with this person. And I know that that was not true. I know it was because it was something very unique that happened to me, but they kind of, whether they did it intentionally or not, it went viral as being their experience. So the important thing I would say is, which leads me right to another, somehow or other these aspects have just gotten imprinted on my head. In Mandali Hall one time, Erich was telling, Mani was there also, sitting by Baba's chair. Erich was in his usual space by the window. And he was telling this story, and I think it might have had something to do with whether it was Mahabaleshwar or Dehradun or something. And somebody in the audience said, well, Erich, last time you told that story, you said it happened in another place. And Erich kind of looked like, and Mani jumped in and said, you're missing the point. She said, what you should pay attention to is the gist of the story. Don't get tangled up in the specifics, whether you because you want to get the date right, or from a historical perspective, yes. But you want to catch the gist of the story. Don't get don't already let your mind play tricks and think this story is no good because of that. And that, to me, what I have tried to do is to capture the gist of what am I going to get from this? How can I use it? Which brings me to what and who the Mandali were and are, to me. We know because Baba tells us that God in his infinite state descends every 7 to 1400 years, takes a human form to live amongst men. That is what's known as God becoming man. That's the God-man. Everybody else, maybe with the exception of Mera, I'm not going to comment about that because I have some thoughts that I'm about that. But everybody else, we are all the souls that are aspiring to make that ascent till we become man-God. God-man is already there. We are trying to attain union eventually, whether we want to or not. That's what Bao used to say. Whether or not you want it or not, you're going to have it. So because of that, the Mandali, to me, at the time that I was with them, they were like my elder brothers, my aunts and uncles. They would, treat everybody very differently. And I was there long periods of time. I go 2-3 months at a time in the early days. So I would see how they would treat people differently. Matter of fact, one time I saw Erich really scold somebody, a resident, for doing something. Scolded him publicly. I mean, it was really kind of harsh. And it wasn't, maybe it was a week or 10 days later, somebody else did the same thing, and Erich put his arm on his shoulder, was very gentle with him. And I thought, wow, what a difference in how to handle that. I wondered why. And when I would walk with Erich in the morning, so I got to question him, he would allow it. And I told him, I said, Erich, why? This is what I saw. He turned to me, stopped, he turned to me. He said, brother, like it says in the Bible, to those whom nothing is given, nothing is expected. To those whom much is given, much is expected. So, yeah. For me, I tried to take that to heart because he's given me so much. So I know there's a lot expected from me. The Mandali were, I would say, what they did, intentionally or inadvertently, is they gave hints on how to live with their stories. One story, which is only published recently. Matter of fact, when I heard this directly from Mani, and I repeated it, I had people tell me I was crazy. Mani never said that. And I won't say who, and these people really surprised me because they were very close to Mani, but they could not imagine this. But you'll see, Mani was a child at the time. She said she always knew that, she was maybe 10, I think she said. She always knew that her brother was God. And she looked forward to whenever she had school break, because she knows she would go see Baba. And she said, as a child, she always knew that she was treated specially. The Mandali were always, Mera, the others were always very special, kind to her. So as she was brought to Baba, I don't know if this was Guru Prasad or Nagar, or wherever he was at the time, but it was a hall and there were a lot of people there. And Mani came in and ran up to him with her arms outstretched to embrace him. And Baba hauled off and slapped her across the face. And Mani said, I still feel the imprint. That's how hard he hit me. And she said her eyes filled with tears. And Baba pointed down. He said, nobody approaches me with sandals on. Mani turned around, ran back with the women. After a while, one of the Mandali came to her and said, Baba wants you. And to see Mani doing, she said, stamped her feet, shook her head like a little annoyed child. And, no, my Baba's calling you. No, she said, you must, whether it was Goer or whoever, said, finally took her by the hand and said, come. And finally she went to Baba, and Baba embraced her and kissed her and reminded her, he said, never approach me with your shoes on. Now, interestingly, that for me, personally, I never approach Baba, even if I'm by myself in my apartment. If I'm going to say prayers, I take my shoes off. And I see a lot of people, and it's their business. They can do what they want to do. But I see a lot of people in different places, sure, at the center, if they're required to take their shoes off, they take their shoes off. But to me, it's the hint that I got from that episode was, this is what you should do in your own life, in your own home, privately. Not for what other people see. Just take your shoes off. Now, a little tie-in story with that, because we need a balance in life. I was in India, Amar Tithi, I believe this was 1981. And we had stayed up all night. Erich would stay up all night. We were all bundled up. He had his top coat on, and we're all sitting around the cabin. We're off to the right of where Baba's body was brought after he dropped the body. So we all would sit on that little ledge around there, and Erich would tell stories and things. And people would go in and out of the samadhi. And at one point, Erich walked over to the samadhi. I walked over with Erich. And there was a fellow sitting there. I don't remember his name. He was an American. I believe he was a chiropractor. Elegantly dressed, better than any of us in those ex-hippie days. This fellow had on a jacket and tie and a shirt and trousers, and Erich greeted him. Erich knew him, as I think he had been a chiropractor. And Erich asked him if he had been in the samadhi, and he said no. And Erich asked him why. The fellow had polio. And in those days, I don't know if they still do, but the metal braces were attached to shoes. You couldn't see the metal braces. And he said, no, I didn't go in. Erich said, why? He said, they told me I have to take my shoes off, and I would have to take my pants off in order to take my shoes off. And Erich just shook his head. He went, come with me. And he took the fellow. So that's the opposite side of, for me, it's like, don't be rigid. You know, just be careful. You know, yeah, Baba said no shoes, but there's exceptions. You know, one of the most difficult times I had with Baba accepting that he could possibly be God, and this is a published story, so this is not something that was told privately. Young girl and a boy came to Baba. They weren't married. She was pregnant. The family didn't know. Baba arranged for her. He told her to go to Bombay, and he arranged for her to stay. It might have been with Arnavaz or something like that. Say, this is published, so you can find it. And he would tell her parents that he wished her to stay with him, not to say anything about her pregnancy. He told the boy that not to have any more contact with the girl. She stayed in Bombay, had the baby. The baby was put up for adoption. That girl later on, Bao, I asked him about it after I read the story, Bao said she still came to see Baba and was devoted to Baba. I don't remember if he said anything about the boy. But it went across it went opposed to my Italian Catholic upbringing that Baba would arrange for this girl to have her baby put up for adoption, not tell her parents. I was not at a point where I could accept I didn't have to understand why Baba did what he did. That's part of the difference in our roles. If I accept him as the God-man, he does what he wants to do because it's his creation. All I have to do is say, okay, Baba. That was just my something. The stories, the way these stories came about, I mentioned earlier about the tape recorder. When I came back to the States, I was spending a lot of time with Fred Winterfeld, who was Fred, Ella, who were the original gatekeepers, or some early gatekeepers here, lived here. And spent a lot of time with them. They would come for dinner. We'd go out to different places. I worked with them on mostly weekends and nights to help them at the gate. And I noticed when people would ask Fred about something about Baba, Fred did not respond immediately. He would take a breath and maybe change his chair or move just to kind of like, I realized he was delaying. And then he would tell a story. And I asked him at one point, I said, Fred, this is what I noticed you do. Why do you do that? He said, Nick, he said, when people ask you for your experiences with Baba, He said, you have to think, if somebody asked you about your intimacy with your wife, how much of that are you going to share? So when people ask you about your intimacy with Baba, don't be careful what you share, because you can dissipate that love. He said, but tell a story that might benefit somebody else. Don't tell a story that's just going to benefit you. You know, there are lots of, I've heard, as I'm sure we all have, oh, Baba came to me in a flash of lightning over the fireplace. So that doesn't do anything for the people listening. That's just you. It's your experience. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it doesn't benefit anybody. He said, so tell stories there. So that came to me. Then the Mandali, as I mentioned, some of them would ask me to tell stories about the other Mandali, because I was spending so much time with them. Or so much time, a lot more than most people, and it was intimate. You know, and Bao would stay with me, and the others would say, well, what happens? What do you do with Bao for 10 hours, 12 hours, you know? And Bao was wonderful, the best guest I've had in my life, really. It was marvelous. As a for instance, well, let me come back to that. Yeah, and at one point, I had a video of either Padre or Pendu's burial. And Mansari was up on the hill. Jal Dastur was here, was visiting in Chapel Hill. And I mentioned that I had this video, and he took it to show Mansari, because Mansari was not able to go beyond, below the tracks, except for a dog. So, and she was very close to whoever it was. I don't remember. That part's confusing for me. Easy enough to find out, but whoever it was that died, and she wanted to see that interment. I think it was Padre, because I remember Pendu was sitting there sobbing and sobbing, because they had been so close for so many years. Part of the reason I ended up with, I mentioned about being close to Jal. In the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, I had a friend in Florida. His name was Barry Gold, one of my early Baba contacts. He went off to India, I believe in 72, 71 or 72. We heard that there was this old man in India who said he was God. And, you know, it was, I was living in Cocoa Beach, Florida at the time. There was quite a lot of people there who knew about Baba. But for me, so there's another old man who claims to be God, so what? In those days, there were a lot of people. You know, I thought, well, I'm probably God too, but not in that sense. But I said, so what? It didn't have any, you know, I was more interested in beautiful women and working and making money in life. I was having too good a life. Anyway, Barry went off to India. And when he came back, he told me, he said, I mentioned your name to Jal, to Baba's brother, and Jal said he wants you to write to him. I said, okay. I didn't think anything of it. And sure enough, later on, at some point, I got a letter from Jal. You know, in those days, blue onion skin, paper, airmail things take 2 weeks to go back and forth. Oh, I miss you. I don't really miss you. We've never met before. So come to India. I was like, I can't. Had no money. I was living in a trailer, you know, and these letters back and forth. And in the meantime, I met the woman who I was going to marry. And again, we would get these letters. She'd come to India. I said, I can't, I'm getting married, and I have, no, you both should come to India. Well, then she got pregnant almost immediately, and I said, we can't come to India, she's pregnant. Well, the next letters, he was writing to this unborn child. He even suggested names. He said, if it's a boy, name him Rama, and if it's a girl, name her Sita. I'm thinking to myself, this guy's nuts. Who is this? You name your child, he's Indian. I'm Italian. Last name is Principe. Was it going to be Rama Principe? I mean, it's like not going to happen. Well, it did happen. But anyway, now you come to India. I can't. It's impossible to come to India because now my wife is pregnant. The child was born, had health issues, was taken to, transferred to major teaching hospital. The obstetrician who delivered the baby was a double for Baba. His name was Anwar al-Hawari. He was Egyptian. The man was maybe 20 pounds heavier, but absolute physical double for Baba. Died 3 months after the baby died. Young man in his 50s. The baby was in the hospital. We had a photo of Baba up over his little, he was only a month old. In a photo of Baba, of course, the nurses, the doctors, they wanted to know who that was. So here we are telling them about what we can about Baba. Anyway, long story short, this story's been told in Mandali Hall. It's recorded. The child died. We received a letter 2 weeks after the baby died, written on the day the baby died from Jal, saying, now you are free, now you can come to India. So that was our connection with Jal, my connection with Jal and going to India. And yeah, found out we actually named, he was a boy, beautiful boy, we named him Ramajal. I mean, when I think of it now, I think, oh my God, if that child would have grown up, he could have become a rapper with a name like that. He would have ended up, yeah. Yeah, you can't make that stuff up. But anyway, named him Ramajal, and went off to India. When Mandali all wanted to know about every bit of the detail, which we did. And when we told Mansari, she threw her head back and laughed and laughed and laughed. She said, do you know what you named your child? I said, well, yeah, Ramajal. She said, yes. She said, Rama is one of the names of God, and Jal means snare or trap. She said, you named your child God's snare, God's trap. But they were, because of that, I think that's one of the reasons why we had intimacy with them. And they, revealed a lot of things. I got to hear a lot of things from them. Spontaneous. I mean, this is something that's not published. One trip when Bao was with me, had a big open floor plan in the house. Living room, the kitchen was all open. I was in the kitchen. He was in the living room doing a private interview with somebody. And I didn't hear all of the details. I wasn't trying to listen, but I wasn't away either. And they both knew I was there. I wasn't sneaking around the corner. I was doing dishes or preparing dinner. And and I heard Jal ask this fellow, he said, but why did you do that? And the fellow, well, I did it because of blah, blah, blah. And John said, yeah, but Bao said, yeah, but you could have done this. Well, no, I did this because and he really held on to why he did what he did. And finally, after he left, Bao came into the kitchen, sat at the table, looked at me, and he said, where there is justification, there is no repentance. And if there is no repentance, there is no forgiveness. And of course, tied in with other stories from the Mandali, they always said, you always just apologize. You can't say to Baba, yeah, I did it because. Even if he told you, even when he would give two orders that seemed to be conflicting, you had to just take it. And in essence, it's like the old stories of the master and Kalyan, and the middle of the day, and the master said, well, it's dark out, and Kalyan went and got a lantern and lit the lantern. You see things the way the master sees things. Don't expect the master to see things the way you see things. I haven't even opened this yet. And lastly, about these stories, how I came to do it. There are a couple of people I'd really like to acknowledge for their help. This goes back, I forget what year. Forgive me, Carol Werner. But I had Amartithi program at the house, my house, and I had the entombment film. And everybody was out in the Florida room, and they were watching the entombment film. And it was a chilly evening, I had the fireplace going. And Carol Werner in Chapel Hill was sitting by the fireplace by herself. And I went over to her to see if she needed anything, asked if she was okay. And she said, no, I'm fine. She said, I've seen the film. She said, what I'd really like is, would you tell me about the story? So I did. And she said, Nick, you ought to write these down. So it might have been around 2000. So from then until 2017, I believe, I walked around with a pencil and paper and wrote down just as many things as I could. I was going into the mountains on the weekends. I was a ski instructor. I would drive up to the mountains. I had a Jeep, and it had a big wide armrest in the center, and I had a pad and pencil, and I would kind of, people were talking about texting. I was driving and writing my notes down that I could go back and get to later. And then 2017, I kind of stopped because I started getting ill, and I subsequently ended up moving to Myrtle Beach. But anyway, I had as many stories as I had written, which were all in kind of notes and little pieces of paper and in a little tablet. I gave everything to Carol, and Carol typed everything up and put everything in some beautiful format. So Carol Werner, I thank you for that. She, somehow or other, it ended up with, from her going to Susan Smith in Chapel Hill. I didn't know how they got there. And because of my health issues, after 2017, there's a lot of my memory that was just gone until fairly recently. It's beginning to come back to me because of heart issues. Anyway, this spring, I got a email from Susan Smith. Nick, I've got all your messages and all your stories and things. What would you like me to do with it? And I said, oh, God. I had no idea. And she sent this whole thing to me, the stack of it's all here, including this. So I thank you, Susan, and I think she also proofed everything. Then I sent everything down to Frank Parker for him to, because we've known each other for almost 50 years. And I said, Frank, just please read this and tell me if you think what do I need to do with it? And he read everything. He said, my God, these are great. He said, just, you need to figure out what to do with it. But except for, updating your intro or things like that, Nothing needs to be done. So, and about, he sent it back to me, and I've taken it all to Sheriar Press. Or, no, I shouldn't say that. I took it all to the Baba Book Room, and I left it with Laura Smith and asked her to read it, let me know what she thinks, and I am probably, the beginning of next week, I'm going to go, and she said, but, if everything is right, then take it to Sheriar, and they'll put it in some kind of a booklet form. So hopefully these will stay alive and will be available. And I've already mentioned to Laura, none of them are to be sold. They are just to be given away, because I think one of the most dangerous things one can do is to try and make money off of Baba. So I'm not interested in doing that. And if anybody wants to, they can make a donation to the center or the trust or to whoever, the archives, whoever they want to. And so this, I'm going to read most of it. I'm going to begin with Elizabeth Patterson, who was the director of the Mayer Center for many years. This particular experience happened in 1970 or 71. I was walking to Elizabeth's house at the center, and someone was asking me about my past. Now I've got to divert here for a minute. I read one time, people had gone to Baba and they said, we did this and we did that. And Baba stopped them and said, no, don't say we, you say I. What did you do? What is your experience? So many of these things I was with somebody else, but I only mention that if it's germane to the story. Otherwise, I'm going to say, just this happened to me. Doesn't mean I was by myself, but it was my experience. Because, and I've had this driven home to me, I've had people with me, we experienced the same thing, but we came away with different results from the experience. So I'm relating to you my experience. So this is asking me about my past. I was, at that time, 26, 27 years old. I was a hairstylist. I was a hippie coming out of the hippie generation. I really didn't want to talk about what I was doing in my past. I was having too much fun to share that with people. And I thought to myself, but she kept persisting, this person. And she got to tell me about, what did you do? How about this, with that? So finally we get to Elizabeth's house. She invited us. We go out to her backyard. We're sitting on the bench in the backyard. And as Elizabeth was chatting with this other person, on my mind was, gee, how am I going to answer these questions? Because I know when we get finished and we start going back, the questions are still going to be there, and I had no idea what I was going to do. And at that point, Elizabeth stopped. She turned to me and said, the strangest thing happened to me the other day. There was a fellow staying on the center with his son, and they decided they were going to get into Baba's compound, even though Baba's house and compound were locked. They decided they were going to climb over the fence. The father actually helped the youngster climb over the fence, but when he got over the fence, he could not unlock the door from the inside, so he had to go through the trouble of climbing back out. Elizabeth then said, what I don't understand is why they are going around telling everybody about this. Why is it that we do stupid things and then we talk about them? Elizabeth had this remarkable ability to just do things on the spot. In another episode in the early 70s, living in Myrtle Beach, I was volunteering at the Gateway in the evening, helping to check people in, which Elizabeth had given me that job. And then she said to me, if you ever see anything that is in disrepair at the center, it needs to be reported immediately. Baba had given her an order to keep the center in repair 100% all the time. A few minutes before the Friday or Saturday program was to begin, I was in the old original kitchen and saw a piece of linoleum peeled up from the floor. And I thought, boy, somebody could trip on that. I found someone to report it to, and they said, okay, we'll take care of it Monday. And I thought to myself, I don't think that is something Elizabeth would think should be left. So I called her directly and told her what I had seen. I said, I'm sorry to bother you. I don't know if I'm being too concerned about it. She said, do you think it might be something in which somebody might be injured? I said, yes, it looks like somebody might trip on that. She said, just wait right there where you are. And within 10 minutes, she was at the kitchen with the person who told me they were going to wait till Monday to repair the flooring right on the spot. So, Elizabeth was not one to be trifled with in any way. Elizabeth's advice to me was give in on everything except those things that are very important. Over the years, I realized that most of the things that I wanted to argue about were not important. I just, want to have my way. One time I asked Elizabeth, do you miss Baba? Her face brightened up and she said, oh no, he's much more available now. When Baba was in the body, he was like perfume in a bottle with a stopper on it. Now that he's left the body, it's as if the stopper has been removed and the fragrance of the perfume permeates the air. Kitty, in the summer of '76, I made my first pilgrimage to India. Upon return, living in Myrtle Beach, I was sitting with Kitty one day in her office. She was curious about what Erich was talking about in Mandali Hall. In those days, Erich seemed to have a topic for each pilgrim season. It might be obedience, it might be love, it might be work. Anyway, at this particular one, he was talking about war. That the conversation focused on the fact that there was going to be another world war. Kitty said, oh yes, I was there when Baba said there would be a third world war. Then she said, but don't make the mistake in thinking this war will be military. The next war will be economic, because Baba said this next war will involve 100% of the people of the planet. Military wars only involve small numbers of people, while economic wars involve everybody. Kitty was marvelous. I smile each time I think of Kitty. As a matter of fact, I have a photo of her smoking a cigarette. Yeah. But Baba, it's up, yeah. Baba permitted her one cigarette a day. I got to spend quite a bit of time with Kitty. I had a little salon in Myrtle Beach, and Kitty, she came up, I did her hair. And she just was, I loved spending time with Kitty. She was just, well, Kitty and Elizabeth to me were like the odd couple. Kitty was, if we were talking about personalities, male and female personalities, like Elizabeth was the male personality, Kitty was the female personality. So Kitty was always like a girl. Elizabeth was forced to be reckoned with. She was very masculine in her business dealings, in her demeanor, everything. And I hope this comes across the way I intend it to. It was, let's just say, well, I don't know how else to put it. Kitty was always, she just reminded me of a girl. I'd take her out to dinner one night. We linked arms. We picked her up at Dilruba, linked arms. She said, I hope you have some good gossip for me. I had the salon. She knew I would hear gossip in the salon, mostly Baba lovers coming there. And as she says that to me, Elizabeth cries out from her bedroom, Kitty, you won't gossip tonight now, will you? So she just, no, Kitty was extraordinary. I asked her one time, she always had this childlike enthusiasm. And I asked her, I said, Kitty, how do you keep that? And she said, Nick, do you know the root of the word enthusiasm? I said, no. She said, entheos, in the state of God. And what immediately flashed in my head is what it says in the Bible, lest you become like little children, you should not enter the kingdom of God. Kitty was childlike, so there was always that enthusiasm. And any of us who have the great good fortune to be around little children, that's how little children are. There's always something exciting for them. We see the weed where they see the flower. Yes, Kitty. It's one of my favorite Baba stories, which I love when I read it again because I think it was so important to me and still is. Maybe more important now than before. One time I was having difficulty with another Baba lover, and I felt terrible because I could not bring myself to feel kindly toward this person. I was really bewildered by it because I was ready to punch this guy in the nose. And I knew I'd get thrown off the center if that happened. Anyway, I was chatting with Kitty about it, and she said, my dear, Baba wants us to love each other. He did not say we have to like each other. That has been now my, if everybody, these nights, they would have banners, that's what I would put on. I want to love you, but I don't have to like you. You have to love me, you don't have to like me. Because I never even thought about what the difference in the words were. We kind of put those two together in so many ways. It's like consciousness and awareness. People interchange those words, and matter of fact, I'm going to jump ahead now because think about it, this is Adi, Baba's secretary. And somebody asked him the difference between consciousness and awareness. Because Baba said that every human being has fully developed consciousness. And Adi said, yes, but we don't have fully developed awareness. And somebody said, what's the difference? And Adi said, it's like this. He said, suppose we'll say that 5 rupees represents consciousness. You have 5 rupees, I have 5 rupees. We have equal consciousness. You know you have 5 rupees. You can go buy a soda. You can buy a pack of cigarettes. I forget that I have 5 rupees. I can't use it. So there are people that have consciousness, but they don't have awareness. And of course, that we see with little children. The child that has to be protected because when the ball rolls in the street, doesn't realize that it might get hit by a car. That's the parents or somebody has to watch that child to be aware, but the child eventually will grow up. And that, I think, is what Baba might mean by when he says, I've come not to teach but to awaken, is to make us aware. Because what happens when you're awake? You're aware. You're aware. It's daylight, it's morning, it's the sun's out, it's raining, whatever it is. How do you feel? Oh, I'm a little bit of a headache. That's awareness of your. So Baba, I think, because consciousness is already there, so it needs to be awakened. Jal, Baba's brother, I would notice that as Jal took us around to various Baba places in Pune, such as the hospital where Baba was born, St. Vincent's School, and Baba's house, I couldn't quite figure out what he was looking at or focusing on. It seemed sometimes he would have his eyes down while he was walking, not even paying attention to where he was going. I asked him about that, and he said to me, and this is a direct quote from John, you have to learn how to look without seeing, listen without hearing, and speak without saying. I'm going to repeat that. You have to learn how to look without seeing, listen without hearing, and speak without saying. My sense of this statement is that it is tied into Baba's comment to be in the world but not of it. To go through the world, to see what you have to see, but to not let it affect you, and not let it touch that deepest part of you. This next story, Bao had asked me to tell him stories about Zhao because he did not spend much time with Zhao. Bao, of course, when they were in Pune, Bao was kept very busy with Baba doing night watch, and then he had correspondence. So he asked me to tell him Zhao stories, something about Zhao. So this is, and this story, Bao told me afterwards, he said, this is very important and you must share it with as many people as you can. Most important Baba's story. So in the summer of '76, in India, there was no pilgrim center, as I mentioned. We would stay from Monday to Thursday night in Lower Mehrabad, and then Friday we'd have to leave. Every weekend we'd go to Pune and be with Zhao. And when we got there, we never knew we were going to stay. He would put us up, he would take us to a hotel, and whatever hotel he chose, that's where we stayed. So he took us to this hotel, and I remember the first floor, old kind of British kind of thing, had this enormous wide staircase, the rooms. No, I don't even think there was an elevator, I don't remember, but it was, our rooms were going to be, my room was going to be on the first floor at the top of the stairs, that landing. Beautiful wide staircase, like in a grand ballroom. And he had picked the hotel, and there we were. So after Zhao and I walked up the stairs and made sure the arrangements were okay, he instructed me. Now I will be here at 7 o'clock in the morning. I will knock at the door and you will say, who is it? And I will say, Jai Baba. And you will say, Jai Baba, only then open the door. Sure enough, the next morning at exactly 7 o'clock, there was a knock on the door. I said, who is it? He said, Jai Baba. I said, Jai Baba, and opened the door. We embraced and off we went on a tour around Pune. He brought me back after lunch for rest, then he would come back in the afternoon for tea, and then again in the evening, either to go out to dinner or to go for some other touring. After 2 days of this, I thought to myself, here is this old man, and he's walking up this flight of stairs. Perhaps I could save him the trouble if I just met him downstairs. Because each and every time he would walk up the stairs, knock on the door, wait for, and only then would I unlock the door. So on the third morning, about 10 minutes to 7, I thought to myself, well, I'll just go down and meet him in the lobby. As I opened the door, there was Zhao coming up on the top step. He looked at me with a surprised look on his face and said, where are you going? I said, well, Zhao, I was going to go downstairs and meet you. He said, why? And I said, well, Zhao, I just wanted to save you the trouble. He said, you don't understand. You are my responsibility. Baba would not be happy with me if anything happened to you. Now go back inside and wait for my knock. I went back inside and he walked back downstairs. So not only did I not save him any trouble, but I actually caused him more trouble. He went downstairs, walked back upstairs, knocked on the door. Who is it? He's Jai Baba, and I opened the door. As I looked at my watch, it was exactly 7 o'clock. He never said anything more about it. I believe the message Baba gave on how to love God, I believe the first thing is to fulfill your worldly responsibilities. That's kind of, to me, what this You know, this is an interesting one because this one causes a lot of controversy. But all I'm doing is relating the experience. There were many bakers in India at that time, and as soon as we would step outside the hotel, the beggars would just swarm around. As I was getting ready to go traveling with Jal to some Baba places, we were leaving the hotel, and sure enough, the beggars came. Jal didn't seem to respond to them one way or the other, and I finally asked him, Jal, isn't there anything to do about these beggars? And he said, well, what would you like to do? I said, can we give them something? He said, give them something out of this crowd? How can you decide who truly needs help and who is doing it just because it is a pastime? I realized I couldn't tell, and then he said, and if you were to give, could you give to all equally? And again, I realized I couldn't do that. And then he said, suppose there is someone there who is an alcoholic. You give him money, and he buys alcohol, and then goes home and beats his wife and children. You then would share in that responsibility. It is best to leave them to Baba. If you feel you must do anything, feed them with your own hands. Jal told me that in his early days in Mandali Meme, part of his duty was to entertain Baba and tell jokes. And I'm going to a little side story here that I'm just remember. I don't even know if it's written yet. Margaret, Jal was famous for kidding around. Margaret Krask told me that, and I believe this story is also published, they were wherever they were in India. Baba told Jal, he said, go get Margaret, bring Margaret. Jal went and told her, Baba wants you. After a little while, Margaret didn't come, and Baba said to Jal, did you tell Margaret? He said, yes, Baba, I told her to come. He said, go tell her again. He went back a second time and a third time. Finally, Baba sent someone else. He said, go tell Margaret immediately. So she came running that time. And Baba said, why did you not come when I sent Jal to tell you? She said, well, Baba, Jal always kids around, so I thought he was kidding. And Baba said, Jal will kid about the entire universe, but he'll never kid about me. Yeah. So he had no knack for jokes, he said. But one of the first times he was called on to do this, Baba had awakened everybody, this Mandali Meme, and they were going on a walking tour. Nobody had tea. Adi, Pendu, Padri, Jal, and whoever else was there, they were all grumbling, and after a while the mood was not very light. Baba was still conversing at the time and took Jal out of earshot and others while they were walking and asked him, why not say something to cheer them up? And then Baba walked on. After a little while, Jal had this inspiration. He said, Merwan, as yet not even called my hair Baba. He said, Merwan. Baba turned and said, yes, what is it? Jal said, I have a confession to make. Now it gave Baba an excuse to stop the halt march, and everybody got to stop and take a rest. Baba asked Jal, what is it? Jal said, it has been troubling me greatly that I must confess to you that I stole something yesterday. Baba said, you stole something? My brother? And you stole something? Jal said, I did it because otherwise I would have broken your order. Baba said, what do you mean break my order? I never gave you an order that you should steal something. How did that happen? And Jal said, well, you remember you told us that whenever the doctor gave us instructions, we have to follow the instructions of the doctor. And Baba said, yes, what is that got to do with it? He said, Baba, yesterday when we stopped and had tea, I had tea and then took 2 spoons. because the doctor had told me take 2 spoons after you have your breakfast. Jal said, Baba and the Mandali all had a big laugh. It had lightened the mood, and from that time on, Jal was always called on to tell jokes. Jal was so good at it. When Baba was in Hollywood, 1932, Baba wanted to meet many of the people, as you know, it's all been documented. One of the people Baba wanted to meet was Boris Karloff, famous actor who played Frankenstein. And he sent Jal. He said, go tell Boris Karloff that he should come meet me. And Jal went and met Boris Karloff, and he said, no, I have no interest to meet him. And Baba said, no, go back, and I must meet him. So Jal went back and got in the conversation, and Boris Karloff prided himself. He had been trained in the traditional British theater, prided himself in being able to control his emotions, being able to cry when he wanted to, laugh when he wanted to, keep a straight face when he wanted to. So he told Jal, he said, you make me laugh and I'll go meet your brother. Anyway, he said afterwards, Mani told me, Jal had him in stitches. And Jal and Boris Karloff kept up correspondence until they died, whichever one died first. Mani told me that. That was how Jal's sense of humor was. Yeah, all of the Mandali, their sense of humor was unique. Bao, when I met Bao, I had met him before, but on this time I was in India, I think it was 81. And Bao was just agreeing to come to the States. He had just accepted an invitation from Christine Pearson, I believe in California. And I happened to be in the trust office and heard this. Now, in those days, Bao would wear, if you see photos of him, he would wear suspenders, bolo tie, T-shirts with Mickey Mouse or whoever. And I asked him if he would come to Chapel Hill. And he agreed to come to Chapel Hill. But I said, in my impertinence, I said, Bao, but I have to give you some advice about coming. Adi had already been to the States. He said, what is it? I said, you can't dress like that when you come to the States. He said, why? The people in the office were shocked that I would say anything. I said, look, you're wearing, Adi was there. Adi had on a scarf and he had a Nehru collar jacket, for those people who remembered what that was. I said, he looked like a disciple of a guru. I said, you don't look like the disciple of a guru. And he said, so I can't dress like this. I said, no, change your wardrobe, please. And that was it. And it was a joke. And I realized, to me it was a joke, and I felt that he took it as a joke. I got my ass chewed out afterwards by people who said, how could you say that to Bao, the chairman of the trust? And I said, come on, it's okay. So buy me a ticket to hell. I don't know, would I do something terrible? So now August comes, the following August, and he comes to the States, and he's staying with me. And we had a 3-bedroom house. I was married at the time. My wife was in our bedroom. The second bedroom, I don't know if my daughter must have been born already. Bao was in a 3rd bedroom. I slept on the floor in the living room because I wanted to be available for him if he needed anything during the night. I didn't want him to stumble around unfamiliar circumstances. John was in the other bedroom. And everybody goes to sleep. And I'm looking from my perch on the floor in the living room, and I could see his lights on. I could see it under the door, which was closed. Anyway, I fall asleep. And periodically, of course, I'm opening my eyes in half sleep, and the light was always on. I've found out much later, subsequent trips, that he rarely slept in those days. He told me, he said, Baba took sleep from him because Baba would give him so much work to do. But anyway, must have been about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. Finally, he opens the door. But he doesn't come out. And I'm thinking, wow, what should I do? And I get up and I go over there, and he's sitting in a easy chair like this in the corner of the bedroom. And he's sitting there like this. Of course, I lost it. I'm just completely hysterical because that's exactly what I had told him he needed to wear. And of course, when I'm making such a ruckus because I'm just laughing uncontrollably, and he is giddy, he is so happy. And with that, everybody wakes up, and John comes rushing in, wanting to know what's going on. And he said, yeah, I understand now. I said, what do you mean understand? He said, well, when we were packing to come, he said, Bao told me, make sure you pack this, those clothes. He said, but Bao, you never wear these things. He said, never mind, you'll see. You'll see. So, and I would dare say I've never seen a photo of him wearing anything like that other than that one time. And that was all just to make me laugh. And it just, he was, I said, their sense of humor, their sense of graciousness, I would say. And that's, to go way back, that's why I say random acts of kindness. If nobody in the world wanted to talk to me anymore, for any reason, if I was a leper, it wouldn't matter, because that's how much they have imprinted in my heart. So after this video, you're gonna really enjoy this one. One of my trips to India, I was a hairdresser. I hadn't gone to nursing school yet. The word got around that I was doing the Mandali's hair. So all the Westerners, the pilgrims, people that worked there, they all wanted haircuts. There was one day I did maybe 20 haircuts in one day there. I became like the local celebrity hairdresser. Getting ready to leave, we had a taxi cab waiting. Went to say goodbye back to the ladies, and Goer and Rano, Meru, they all walked out to the front with me. Went to hug and say goodbye to Pendu. And at that point, there were, and I'm really not exaggerating, there must have been 20 people that stood in a queue wanting to hug me. My head was like this. I felt really like the king of Siam or some place, just thinking about how wonderful I was. What a brilliant time this whole thing had been, and everybody really loved me. It still brings back that sweet memory. And Erich walking out to the car, he puts his arm on my shoulder. He said, brother, it seems like everybody really loves you. And I said, yes, Erich, it seems that way. And then he said, in 5 minutes after you're gone, nobody will remember you. It's one of the greatest gifts anybody's ever given me. Because that's really the way it is. That's one of the reasons I can live alone, not see anybody. It's because I know I'm going to be forgotten. And that's fine. It's Baba who needs to be remembered. It's again another important story that I was told needs to be told. After spending most of the summer in India, it was time for me to return home. It was a tricky thing to do because I had sold everything I had before I went to India, except a car which had some personal possessions in it. And by the way, the car's trunk leaked, so I got back to the States to find whatever personal possessions I had in the trunk were ruined because the car leaked. So I was sitting with Jal for the last time before going back home. And Jal would have a habit of saying, "What's on your mind? What are you thinking?" So he said to me, "Now, what will you do when you go back to the States?" I said, "Jal, I have no idea." I said, "I have no place to live and I have no job." He told me, "What do you mean you have no job? Your job is to love Baba. And why do you say you have no place to live? What difference does it make where you live as long as Baba lives in your heart?" Minu Barucha. For those who knew Minu, when I met him, he was already quite elderly, but it was a nice meeting. He was an electrical engineer, had been with Baba Shan and had been with Upasni. And then Upasni sent him to Baba. He actually was laying out the electrical grid for Lower Mehrabad, because in those days there was no electricity. And he took me with him and we went around, all around Mehrabad property. So where I was holding whatever it was, the stick or whatever that's called, where he would, peer through whatever his device was and to lay out where the power poles were. So we had a nice contact. He had stayed with Upasni for many years. He would maintain Upasni's car. And I had heard that Baba had told Minu that this was his last birth. On this particular trip, which was in 81, I was absolutely and completely overwhelmed with most ungodly thoughts. Despicable thoughts, lustful thoughts, even as I was walking up the hill to the tomb. I was waiting to go into the samadhi. These thoughts would just assail me. And I felt so bad that perhaps I thought I shouldn't even go up to the samadhi. I found myself wanting to avoid people because I was so troubled by these thoughts. I almost felt as if anybody looking at me would know what I was thinking. After a week of this god-awful torment, I got up the nerve to approach Minu. And I said, "Minu, may I speak with you?" He said, "Yes, come for tea." So that afternoon, I went over for tea to his little room, and he said, "What is it? What's on your mind?" I said, "Minu, I heard that Baba said this is your last lifetime." His eyes flashed, and he said, "What business is that of yours?" I said, "Minu, please, I am not prying into that, but I have a question for you. But only, indeed, if Baba did say that to you. If Baba did not say to you, then I won't even ask you the question." He said, yes, Baba said that to me, so what is your question?" I said, "Minu, what do you think about?" This is your last lifetime. What do you think about? He looked at me and said, "Why do you ask such a question?" And I said, "Well, I'm just so troubled by thoughts that I have. I've been carrying a camera bag with me." He said, "Nick, to tell you the truth, brother, the moment you walked in, I thought, I wonder if he has anything in that bag that I could pinch." I said, "You have these thoughts even now, your last birth, and you think about stealing something?" He said, "Yes." He said, "These thoughts are still there." He said, "The difference is not to act on them. Whatever the thoughts are, just remember the thoughts and leave the thoughts alone." Fred Winterfeld. Fred Winterfeld said to me, the spiritual journey is from here to here. I didn't explain what that meant, and I didn't think to ask him. But over the years, I've come to believe that it might have something to do with the fact that when we find out about Baba, we might read something, we see his photo, we might see a video, but it mostly sits here. That has to be transferred to the heart before it becomes, it could be for some, it goes right there. But I think for others, it might take lifetimes. So we find out about Baba, and intellectually we gather all that information. But it's here. But it has to, at some point, percolate down. Fred used to say, working for Baba, the pay is terrible, but the retirement benefits are out of this world. Before, when I mentioned about the withdrawal and the beggars, and if you give them money and they buy alcohol and beat their wife and children, you share responsibility. One of my first trips to the center, 71 or 72, I parked my car at the gateway, and Fred asked me, did you lock your car? I said, lock it? I didn't think it was necessary to lock it on the center. He said, oh, no, you must lock it. He said, this is the Kali Yuga, age of destruction. If you lock the car and somebody steals it, then you are free of responsibility. But if you leave the keys in it and somebody steals it, then you share in the responsibility. So how karma, that whole thing, how that happens, which is something I've thought about recently. Backbiting. I probably personally have heard more confusion about that, because Baba said backbiting is bad, is wrong. But I've been in India when I heard Erich talking about Baidul. He said, oh, Baidul was very crude. And somebody in the Westerner sitting there said, but Erich, that's backbiting. And he said, that's not backbiting. He said, but you're saying something terrible about the guy. He said, but that's how he was. He was crude. And when Adi was asked about it, Adi said, it's backbiting if you have rancor in your heart. You can say anything about anybody, personality trait, if you love them. You know, I mean, Baba would say to somebody, oh, you've gotten fat. Does that mean Baba's backbiting that person? You know, Erich said to me one time, he said, that's quite a barrel you're carrying. You know, referring to my midsection. It's not backbiting. I never felt anything but love from Erich. As a matter of fact, a little side thing with Erich again I'm reminded of. First trip to India. Stayed at the center for almost 2 weeks before going to India. Watched a lot of films about Baba. And there were very few books available then, knew very little about Baba. I think there were 4 or 5 books available. When watched a film of Baba, and Erich had washed his hands, poured water over his hands. Baba held his hands over a basin. Erich poured water over him. I think it might have been in Mirzad Mandali Hall. And then after Baba washed his hands, Erich had a towel folded over his arm, and he bowed to Baba like this and presented the towel, and then Baba took the towel and dried his hands. So now they're at the center 2 weeks off, I go to India, so excited to meet all these people. The first day we're there, Mani is there, Rano is there, Erich is there. They're all working in the trust office. Mani's talking to somebody. I'm standing right next to them because I want to hear. It wasn't a private conversation. I wanted to hear what she was saying. And I felt something was bothering me under the sandal. Well, I lifted my foot and looked, and there was a cigarette butt stuck to my sandal. I tried to scrape it off. I couldn't. I reached down and flicked it off with my finger. At that moment, Erich comes out of his office. I've already been introduced to him. And he looks at me, and he says, "Nick, you pig, how have you been raised?" And I was crushed. I was crushed. I was so embarrassed. And I could feel the tears well up in my eyes. He said, "Come with me." I followed him. We went through his office. He had a desk on one side, Mani on the other side. We went through the office. The back veranda, there was a sink there. He said, "Wash your hands." Wash my hands. And he tells me while I'm washing my hands, he said, "The ground in India is one big toilet." He said, "Never touch anything like that with your hands again. It's filthy." And I'm just internally just weeping, sobbing, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm getting out of here. So again, this is before the other thing about you got to give up sex. In that sense, I got slapped around a bit. But anyway, I washed my hands, and the towel rack is there, and as I look, there's no towel on the towel rack, and I turn, and there's Erich with a towel over his arm, like this. And I realized that what he was doing was serving the Baba in me. The Mandali never did any of that stuff for themselves. It was obvious if you had the eyes to see it. It was for our benefit. And I would recommend anybody to get as much information about the Mandali. There are videos available. Go online, you can buy videos. It's been said for millennia that one of the most important things is to spend company with the saints and the lovers of God. And I don't know any that are truer lovers than the Mandali in the true sense because of they don't just sit in a room and sing and dance for themselves. They're working for him. And when I think to myself how annoying we must have been to Erich to sit there and repeat the same stories over and over for years and years, and I would hear the most ridiculous things in there, and not only from myself, from other people. And they always met everybody with compassion and gentleness and kindness. I asked one more with Fred Ella, if I may, because this one's kind of important. I asked Fred Ella, his wife, if they knew whether Baba had ever said anything about divorce. Fred said he had asked Baba, and Baba had said, as long as two people agree, then you can divorce. But one should not leave the other because then the karma is not finished. Well, also, and this is something that I've kind of learned with Baba. Baba, he was asked one time what his profession was. He said he was a businessman who turned liabilities into assets. And I've come to realize that that's kind of what he does with us individually, in the sense that, for instance, Baidul, Baba's famous must hunter, was not only crude, as Erich said. Now that's going to become very important as I mention this. It was very crude. He also was what most people would call nosy. He was always asking everybody, where are you from? Who's your mother? Who's your sister? Did you go swimming in that river? Did you know? Now, when I say crude and it was an asset, is that Erich had said, Baba would call Baidul and he'd say, I want you to go to Rishikesh. And there's a mosque there in Rishikesh. I want you to go and contact this mosque. Erich said, just with the clothes on his back, he would just immediately go. It's not like, I'm going to go tell my wife, I'm going to take care of the kids. He just went, because that's what Baba said. So he would just go. You know, and he knew that Baba would direct him internally, which is what happened. He knew. So, you know, that to me, so that nosiness is how he became famous for hunting the musts, because he knew where they all, because he would go and ask, and he had that comfort. So, you know, there are people who are shy and don't want to, you know, that's not the kind of person to give that work to. So that's why I say here is this, for many people, they would see it as a liability that he was crude. You know, Erich would say he'd be gone for sometimes for a week. He'd come back, he'd have on exactly the same clothes that he left with. Nothing, he wouldn't pack anything. He would, if he didn't have enough money, he would beg for food, he would beg for money for train fare. It was just go, that's what Papa wanted. That's turning liability to an asset. Nanakare. Nanakare was a school teacher. Had been with Baba. Actually, Baba had given him some work to do even during their new life. And that's all documented. So I don't know anything about that, and anybody who wants to know can find out about it. But when he retired, he moved to Lower Mehrabad and became he and Mansari shared the duty at the Samadhi. People going in, one or the other of them were always on duty to greet people, to give them prasad. After about a week, I was there a week, I just looked at him, and now mind you, that first trip, there were 6 Westerners in India at the time. There was nobody there. We used to go in the Samadhi. We could sit on the ledges of the window and read what God Speaks in there. I would read God Speaks sitting in the Samadhi. It was just, you know, but there was nothing to do. There was, you know, we'd have tea with Mansari in the afternoon. That was it. But I just wondered, and he would sit there for hours and hours. The only time he and Mansari would spell each other was mealtime or bathroom or something like that. Otherwise, either one of them was always there. You know, when I would go, I'd walk around, I'd go to the museum, I'd go back to the library, I'd go see Mansari, I'd go back down the hill. I was restless, and there he was, just sitting there hour after hour. I was just thinking, how does he keep from being bored? I never said anything to him. After a day or two where these thoughts were coming into my head, he turned to me and said, the cure for boredom is in the repetition of Baba's name. Mera. Mera. This is a private message that Mera gave me, but I think it's applicable to everybody. When my daughter Marie was born, and I was wondering what to do about her education. Public school, private school, things like that. Do I put her in Catholic school? I was even willing to rejoin the Catholic faith to get her in a Catholic school because it was regarded as a better school than the public school. I asked Mara about it, and she said, you take care of Marie's values, leave her education to Bob. Marie was one of the things that caused some domestic problems because I didn't care if she didn't do homework or not. If she wanted to go ice skating on a Thursday afternoon, we went ice skating. My concern was to keep her happy. I'd get in battles with her teachers because she wouldn't do what work they wanted her to do. She was 7 years old. I took her out of school to go to India. They got so upset, and she's just in kindergarten. She's in first grade. When you're 7 years old, you get a trip to India or being here learning how to spell cat. I mean, come on. So, but it caused a lot of problems because not everybody felt that way. Now, she's got a master's degree from Tufts. She's got 6 languages. She travels all over the world. She's got a great career. And Baba has taken care of her education. Much better than I could ever dream of. So I would say that even though that was said to me, it's something that we should all pay attention to. Make sure your children are happy. Pay attention to that. Don't pay attention to whether or not they sit right in the classroom or not. Just, and if I wish I could go back and correct, those things that I missed because I didn't know to do that with my son, who's older than her. But I got to with Marie. But as I say, it caused its own problems. This was fun, and it's one of these stories that's come back to me that somebody else claims it as theirs, and I'm sure this didn't happen more than once. During one of my pilgrimages, on a day when Merazad was closed, Erich arranged for me to escort a young woman to Merazad because she was only going to be in India for the day. He wanted me to escort her to meet the women Mandali. I was thrilled to receive this opportunity to go there because otherwise Merazad was closed. The meeting was arranged for a particular time, and that time came, but the woman didn't show up. I waited about an hour. Finally, Erich came along and said, "Why are you still here?" I said, "Erich, she has not shown up." He said to me, "Your obligation is 10 minutes. You wait 10 minutes. If the person doesn't show up, you leave." That's what I did. Now that, by the way, as an aside, I took that even in my business. As a hairdresser, I allowed 15 minutes for people to be late. If they were longer than 15 minutes late, they either had to pay me for that appointment or I wouldn't see them again. Or we'd reschedule the appointment. Conversely, if I was late for them, I'd do their hair for free next visit. So I held myself to the same standard. Because if you allow people to do what they want to do when it comes to scheduling appointments, then it's especially if you have, for people who are working, then you have a domino effect. It affects everybody if you have clients booked every hour or every 2 hours. Later, we came to find out that the reason why this woman didn't show up was that she had arranged to stay another day. She approached Erich again, and he arranged for her to go out to Merazad. Again, I was to take her. It was tea time. Merazad was still closed. Off we went. I took her to Merazad, and I took her around, introduced her to everyone, of course. They were expecting her. What a blessing it was, because Mara invited her for tea, and she asked whether I would like tea as well. We all sat down on Mara's porch. Mara left to go inside, and then returned a little while later with a tray, teacups, sugar, and cream. No, the cream was already in the tea, but with her own hand. Oh no, tea was separate. And with her own hand, Mara served this woman tea, and then asked if she would like cream and sugar. And the woman said yes to the cream, and then started in a tirade about how bad sugar was. That's part of the reason people in India have such terrible teeth, because of the sugar they eat. I was mortified and so embarrassed, I wanted to crawl under a rock, that somebody would be saying this to Mara. And Mara looked and just laughed like a little girl, threw her head back, and said, "Oh, my dear, do you think whether or not you eat sugar is going to make any difference in your love for Baba?" Adi, Sr., was Baba's secretary for more than 50 years. He was asked one time whether Baba takes on your karma. He said, "No, Baba doesn't take karma from you. But for the lovers of Baba, he will make your karma smoother." And then he gave an example that there might be one fellow who is not a Baba lover. He gets into a car accident. The car will roll down a ditch, and the fellow is injured and lies there for hours, and nobody knows that the car has fallen into the ditch. Finally, somebody passes by, sees the accident, and brings him to the hospital. There, after a long time, he recovers and returns home. Now, with a Baba lover, he may have the accident, but the next car right behind will stop. They take him immediately to the hospital, and just as he is brought into the hospital, an expert surgeon is there who says, "I'll just take care of this right away." Both have met with the same fate, the same destiny, Adi said. But for those with Baba, he just smooths the way and makes it a little easier for us. And I am telling you that is exactly what happened to me. Before moving to Myrtle Beach, I was driving home from work. My car hydroplaned. I went into a ditch, totaled my car, which landed on its side in a water-filled ditch. The car behind me was a female physician who was in the emergency room at UNC, and a nurse friend going to work. They stopped. Exactly as this story was told in the 70s. This happened to me many, many years later. Exactly that. Passed through it, but exactly, Baba was right there. Adi was asked about prayer. It was at a time when Fred Winterfeld was in the hospital with cancer. And somebody asked Adi if it was all right to pray. And Adi said, "Of course, yes, it's all right to pray for Fred." And then he said, actually, there are 3 types of prayer. The first type of prayer is when we ask for something for ourselves. That is the lowest form of prayer. A higher form of prayer is when you pray for someone else. But the prayer that pleases Baba is just the prayer of praise of God. Adi was asked one time what he valued in this world of forms. And he replied his most valuable possession was time. And somebody said, "Time? What about family and, money and cars and things like that?" And Adi said, "Sir, all those things can be replaced." He said, "Time once spent, never recovered." One of my personal favorites, which I often share with other people, and I haven't thought about this for a long time, so I'm grateful for the opportunity. Eric said to me one time, "Live your life like a caretaker." I said, "I don't understand. Please explain." He said, "Suppose you are an ordinary man and you have a friend who has a large home and servants. He contacts you and tells you he's going traveling for a year and wants to know if you would come and stay at his place for the year. You have your little bag with a change of clothes, toothbrush, shaving equipment. You go knock on the door. Your friend greets you, introduces you to the servants, and says, "Now, please make yourself at home, and I'll return in a year." Now what happens is for the first week or so, you feel awkward. What happens for the cook comes and asks, "Nick, what would you like for dinner tonight?" And you say, "Oh, nothing, I'll just fix some cornflakes or something." And the chauffeur says, "Shall I have the car ready for you, sir? Would you like to go anyplace?" No, I'll just walk." So you feel awkward at first, but after a month or two goes by, you feel so comfortable that you give instructions to the cook. "Look, yesterday when you scrambled my eggs, they were quite not right. I'd like them done a little differently, with a little seasoning. Now when the chauffeur comes, you say, 'Yes, please be ready at 2 o'clock because I have someplace I would like to go.'" Now what happens is that after a while, you forget that it's not your home. You forget. You live there as if it is your own. After 8 or 9 months go by, you get a reminder postcard from your friend who says, "Now I shall return on such and such a date." So then you begin to have little pangs that soon you'll have to leave all this. Sure enough, on the day when your friend shows up, he thanks you. You pack up your bag with your clothing and toothbrush and you leave. So Erich said, live your life in such a way as a caretaker. Erich was asked one time about imagination. What attention should we pay to it? Erich said there is significant use of the imagination and insignificant use of the imagination. Try to involve Baba in everything that you talk about. If you talk about going to see a play, try to think, I wonder if Baba would like this kind of play. If you're reading a book, try to ponder, oh yes, Baba used to like Tales by Rudyard Kipling or Mysteries by Agatha Christie. Involve Baba, and then it becomes significant use of the imagination. The Darshan program one time, and after the program, as was Baba's habit, he would ask Erich, what do you think? How was the program? And Erich would give whatever, oh, Baba, everybody liked your message. And then Baba would ask him about individuals. Did you see so-and-so? Oh, yeah, and Baba might say, oh, he's gotten stout, he's put on weight, or the kids have grown, he gesture. He said, yes. And then finally Baba asked about this one fellow, and Erich didn't answer. And Baba said, tell me, why don't you answer me about him? And Erich said, Baba, he said, I don't care for him. And Baba said, why? He said, well, I don't think he's sincere. And Baba said, you're right, he's not sincere. But you have no idea how far he's come to get here. Something on my mind going back to backbiting. In the early days, Erich and Mani would remind us in Mandali Hall, and I've not seen this anyplace in print. Not that I've read everything, so it may be in print, but I know it was talked about frequently. They said never. They would tell Baba lovers who were in Mandali Hall, they said never get upset with anybody who backbites you because they're doing your dirty laundry. That was the expression they used. They said they take your bad sanskaras. I had forgotten about that until recently. And I realize now that what a blessing it is to have somebody backbite me. Just take all my dirty laundry that you want. Take it all. Be done with it. So these, because these a couple of stories are so familiar to me, I don't have to read them. Erich was a relatively young man. He, with Bob, he might have been in his late teens, early 20s. And some of his friends came and they wanted Erich to go do something with him. And he said, no, I can't. I'm with Baba now. And one of them said, but what good is it? You used to be available. You were so nice. Now you stay with him. You don't have time for any of your friends. You're not as nice now as you used to be. And Erich thought about it, and they're right. I'm not as nice as I used to be. So he got to be helping Baba prepare for rest for the evening, and Baba asked him again, what's on your mind? And Erich told him, and Baba said, you're right. I don't, he said, you're correct. You're not as nice. And then Baba said, do you know how sugar cane is made? And Erich said, yes, the farmers go and gather and cut the cane. And Baba said, and then what did they do? And Erich described how there was a large cauldron and the sugar cane would be put in and it would be stirred. This was all in the field. And Baba said, and then what did they do? And Erich realized that he didn't quite know. And Baba said, after it is stirred for a while, the scum rises to the surface and has to be skimmed off. Only then is the sugar cane good to be used. Similarly with you, everything needs to rise to the surface, be skimmed off, and then what's left is usable. Erich said he was so busy with his job reading Baba's gestures, he realized he never got to look into Baba's eyes because he was always focusing on Baba's hands. But people would say, oh, Baba's eyes are so beautiful. They would describe this beauty, those pools of love. And Erich said one day, he never said anything to Baba about it. And after Baba finished with the morning business, Mandali Hall, he sent all the men out and motioned for Erich to stay. He had Erich pull a chair up in front of him and just gaze in his face. Erich said as he looked into Baba's eyes, tears started streaming down his face. And Baba reached over and caressed his face and said, do you love me? And Erich said, Baba, I don't know. Because Erich used to say that he went to Baba as an observer. Baba said, never say you don't love me. Say you love me, and one day you will. Now, come and kiss me on the cheek. Which, while I was rereading all these and preparing for this, I realized I have a stack of correspondence from the Mandali. I have much time spent with them. Never once did I ever hear anybody say to me or to anybody else, I love you. They said it to Baba. And I think to myself how we throw that word around. I know I'm guilty of that. But it's their love was for Baba. Mani, I got postcards and letters from Mara, love to all. That Mani would draw a heart with something, but it was never, I love you. It was always Baba. First trip to India. Went into the samadhi, came out, and somebody handed me some orange candy and said it was prasad. And I said, what is that? And they said, you can't eat it, it's prasad from Baba. And I questioned it because I only had limited readings about Baba, and I read that prasad was a gift from the master's hand. So I thought, this is not from Baba, it's from this little old lady. So it was inappropriate. I thought somebody else would be giving out pieces of candy and calling it prasad. As I was walking with Erich, I mentioned to him, I'm not comfortable with this. And Erich said to me, brother, The very air you breathe is prasad if you take it as such. One day while walking with Erich, I said, Erich, and I'm so embarrassed by this now, but I'm glad I asked it at the time, but now I'm embarrassed. I said, Erich, you don't look happy. I mean, can you imagine saying something like that to Erich? He stopped me and said, I don't look happy? I said, I never see you smile. And Erich, I would dare say you look films of Baba, of Erich. You rarely see him with maybe a little bit of a grin, but he was not like a happy camper. He didn't give that impression. You know, he wasn't the type to burst out laughing. So I just said, you don't smile. Brother, he said, don't think that the external has anything to do with what's going on the inside. The real happiness, which is inside you, you can't see. And then he said, the day will come when you will welcome suffering. Don't invite it, but when it comes, you will welcome it. I found many, many years later that when real suffering came, I realized that up to that point I had been remembering Baba mechanically. The remembrance just came from my head to my mouth. But when the suffering reached its peak, I called out to Baba from a place that was so deep within me that I did not recognize the voice. At that moment, Baba was sitting in the car next to me. I can place exactly where it happened, the time at 10 o'clock in the morning on my way to work. Stopped at a traffic light, crying out to Baba for this suffering. And I realized at that moment that's what Erich meant. That calling out from the depths of one's being, not just the mechanical repetition, is what brings Baba's presence to us. And I thank God for aging, because there's plenty of suffering. And with that suffering comes the opportunity to welcome his presence. I was with Fred Winterfeld, pancreatic cancer. Had a key to the center. When his suffering would get really bad, in the middle of the night, Ella would call. We'd go to This Has to Be a We story. My wife was a nurse. We'd go to get on the center, it might be 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. She would give Fred an injection of Demerol to ease the pain. Then she'd take Ella and go in the kitchen and have a cup of tea, and I'd sit with Fred. And he had pancreatic cancer. His stomach was enormous, what they call ascites, swollen. It looked like he was 9 months pregnant. And he was laying on the bed, clasping his abdomen, his stomach just rolling back and forth, just moaning, loudly moaning. And I just thought to myself, oh, Baba, why such suffering for this man who loves you so much? And all of a sudden, Fred stopped, looked at me. He said, Nick, you like the song I'm singing? Yeah. And then went back to that. And I realized that the difference between the body and the soul, the body and the spirit. His body was suffering, his spirit was not. It gave me hope for myself and for others. That's why I don't lament when I see suffering, when I feel suffering myself. It doesn't really touch me inside. I was troubled one time because in the prayer of repentance, we're asking for forgiveness for telling lies, but we're also asking for forgiveness for hurting people's feelings. So I asked Erich, how do you reconcile the two? How do you tell the truth and not hurt somebody's feelings? Erich said, in the life spiritual, the truth is anything that uplifts the spirit. That's the truth. Anything that degrades the spirit is a lie. And then he said, suppose you work for a man who's an honest man and treats you well. Some person comes to apply for a job and you happen to know that this person is a thief. So you say to your boss, sir, excuse me, and then you tell him about this. Your motive is to protect the boss. Then that becomes the truth. Now, suppose that you work for somebody that you don't like, and you keep thinking, boy, one day he's going to get his. And when someone comes for a job and you know you is a thief, you know he is a thief, you don't say anything because you hope this person will now steal from the boss. Now this is a lie. Not saying anything, you've lied. One evening in my home, I had a poster about real happiness lies in making others happy. I had gone to sleep. There was a bit of a party. I had to go to work next morning. I was awakened. They were drunk. Somebody was throwing pieces of fruit in the air. Somebody else was stabbing the fruit with a fork or a knife, and I lost it and chased everybody out. And somebody pointed to the poster and they said, well, I guess you don't really believe that. Real happiness lies in making others happy. And I really had I didn't know how to answer that. So I asked Erich, how do you reconcile that? He said, in making others happy, never compromise your own values. He said, suppose a man is married to a good wife, but he meets another woman and she says, it would make me happy for you to have intercourse with me. He said, would you do such a thing? Of course not. He said, never compromise your values. That's as far as you have to go. That, to me, these hints about how we should live, that is what one of the richest things that we can get from the Mandali, even now. Still, because their words are still valid. I asked Erich about obedience, how difficult it was to obey Baba. In response to my question, he said, be very careful. You have to obey the spirit of the order. Obeying the letter of the order you may do, but you may be missing the spirit. When I asked him to explain, Baba said, only to have sex with one's wife. Now suppose you have a good marriage and a good wife, but you desire another woman. You don't have any involvement with this other woman, but you divorce your wife so that you can have involvement with this other woman. Now technically you have obeyed the letter of his order, but haven't you broken the spirit of it? Erich told about people coming to see Baba, and they were in their peak at that time. Erich was like a bull. Padre Pendula was like a wrestler. They were all very strong. Anyway, this one fellow came, and he had a beard. And Baba asked him why he wore a beard. And the fellow gave some different answers, but it didn't satisfy, so Baba kept pressuring him, why are you wearing that beard? And finally, Baba asked him, do you think that beard makes you look more like a man? And the fellow said, yes, that was why he wore a beard. And Baba pointed to the men Mandali and said, you see these people here? And Baba said, nobody here is a real man except me. Do you know what it means to be a real man? And the fellow shook his head, no, I don't. Baba said, to be a real man is to always be under self-control. One thing Erich told me, and I'll share it, but I'm going to say be careful with this one. The first Duni that I was in India for, And I had heard, you're supposed to throw something in the fire with a sandalwood stick. So I went to Erich and I asked him what I should throw in the fire. Some people said they were throwing in lust, or somebody was throwing in anger. And I said, Erich, what should I throw in? He said, throw yourself in the fire. Be careful of that. You take it as you like, but throw yourself in the fire. One day in Mandali Hall, Erich was asking people whether they argued or not. Some would say yes. Some would say no. When he got to me, and I was with my wife, and told him, yes, we argued. He said, good, stand up. We did, and he went on. He gave us a big hug. And somebody said, wait a minute, why do they get a hug for arguing? And he said, do you know how to get the rough edges off of stones? He said, you rub them together. Important with these stories. One day in Mandali Hall, Erich was asking people to tell their stories about coming to Baba. Well, there's one fellow started going on and on. It was supposed to be his story of coming to Baba, but it seemed like it was really just his life story. Describing what he said, then I went to Chicago, then I moved to Paris, then I didn't like Chinese food, so I went someplace else. His story became so tedious that people were actually getting up and leaving Mandali Hall. As I sat there, I thought, oh my goodness, I didn't come all the way here just to hear this fellow's life story. I want to hear stories about Baba. I want to hear about the Mandali's experiences. And I decided that I had had enough, and I also was a fraction of a second away from getting up. It was one of the few times I saw Erich with a flash in his eyes. He said, where is everybody going? It was pretty obvious. It was more than just a few people who left. He said, you all better get used to listening to each other. What are you going to do when we're gone? Part of the reason why I'm doing this is that I know that a lot of people have stories about Baba, about the Mandali. They think they can't share them for some reason, one reason or another. I would say to that, and I actually have this recorded from Adi, when somebody said they were shy or something about telling stories about Baba, he said, sir, he said, so you have a relationship with Baba, you're solid with your relationship with Baba, something like that. And the fellow said, yes, yeah, Baba and I, we have a good relationship. He said, then don't you want to share that with your brother? Don't you want to pass that on? So that's what this is. So I would encourage anybody, jot down notes, go back, look at photos, ask Baba to help you. Chat with people. If you've taken a trip to India with other people, ask them. I went with my daughter to India 3 times. We still talk about the memories we had when we went when she was 7 years old. And she's now in her late 30s. So, it's, as time goes by, these memories, as one gets older, these memories will sustain you in ways because, and it's a little aside, for 15 years, I had a contract to provide services in a retirement community in Chapel Hill. I was in my 50s. I worked with people who were minimum of 50 up to 100 and 1 or 2 older. I was there 15 years. What I saw is the people that had lots of memories of love, long after children were gone, spouses were gone, that love made the end of their life tolerable. The people who dedicated their lives to careers and had no children, no loved ones, perhaps no relationship with the divine, they hung on to life as if it was going to last forever. So what Baba has given us is this knowledge that we have something else to look forward to. We have more to look forward to than dinner. One time I asked Erich how he dealt with remembrance of Baba. He took me into his room. He had a table with a plated glass on it. That was his desk. And he had some pencil notes under the glass. He had me sit down and copy them, which I have. These were messages and prayers that were given by Baba to Erich. Baba told Erich, the first thing upon awakening in the morning you should say, "Thank you, Baba, for this new life. Please help me to please you." And just before going to sleep at night, you should say, "Baba, thank you for this day. I lay all my thoughts, words, and deeds at your feet." Once Erich was asked about sticking up for oneself. He said, "You must speak out, but Baba never wanted us to hurt anybody." And then Erich told us a story that came from the perfect master, Sri Ramakrishna. One time there was a cobra in India feared by the villagers because it was huge and fearsome. When it would raise its head up, it had this huge hood, and everybody would run and be afraid of it. One day the master was walking in the area where the cobra lived, and the cobra approached the master and bowed his head at the master's feet. And the master asked, "Cobra, what can I do for you?" The cobra said, "Master, please, I'm so tired of hurting people. I bite and I'm so tired of it. Please release me from this form." The master said, "Cobra, I will return on such and such a day. If in that period of time before I come back you have not hurt anybody, then I will release you from this form." So the master went on his way, and the locals found out that the cobra was now avoiding them whenever they were near it. When the farmers and the children would approach it, the cobra would slither off in another direction. Then everybody got emboldened, and children actually began taunting the cobra, throwing sticks and stones at it. And the cobra took to hiding and couldn't even forage for food. Then on the promised date, the master returned. Now the cobra, a mere shadow of what it was before, slowly slithered before the master and lowered its head in this weakened state. The master said, "Do I know you?" "Yes, master, I'm the cobra that asked for your blessing." The master said, "I can hardly believe you are the same cobra. You were so beautiful, your skin so shiny, you had such a lovely hood. Now I look at you and you're emaciated. What has happened to you?" The cobra said, "I'm like this because of obeying your order." The master said, "Why do you say such a thing? Why would I give such an order?" And the cobra said, "Well, master, you told me not to hurt anybody." And the master said, "Yes, I told you not to hurt anybody, but I did not say you could not hiss at somebody." Erich was asked one time about trusting the Baba within other people. Erich told a story about a fellow in India who was listening to the master, and the master was talking to his Mandali and saying that God resides within each and everything. The fellow got up and leaves, and now he's walking around, he's looking with new eyes, thinking God is everywhere and in everything. And he looks differently at the buffalo and the trees and the birds, and he's thinking God is in each of these things. As he continues his journey, all of a sudden there are people running towards him shouting, "Get out of the way, turn, run the other way." He says, "What is it?" And they say, "There's a mad elephant out of control." But this fellow is thinking God is in everything, so what do I have to fear? And as he continues, sure enough, they're charging toward him as an elephant. And on its back is a mahout shouting, "You fool! Get out of the way! Can't you see that I can't control this elephant?" And with that, the fellow keeps thinking, God resides in everything. He continues his forward motion. With that, the elephant reaches with his trunk, picks this fellow up, and hurls him across the road into some bushes and trees. And this fellow is just battered and bruised. And after he has recovered, he happens to be again with the master. And the master looks at him. He's still carrying some of the scars from the thrashing by the elephant. And the master asks him, "My goodness, what happened to you?" And he says, "Master, this happened because of you." "Why?" He said, "Because you gave me the wrong information." "Why did I say that? What did I say that was wrong?" "Master, you told me God is in everything, so I trusted the elephant." "Yes, but why did you not listen to the God in the mahout who told you to get out of the way?"